So what were the big legal trends and issues for employers in 2021? Well, in my view, there were two. The first one was COVID related, obviously. So a couple of issues in relation to COVID for employers, probably more than a couple, but the main ones. So at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, we had a huge push to get employees who had scattered themselves around the globe back to Ireland. So that was driven by a whole host of employment law, income tax, corporation tax, social security considerations. It was complicated in or around kind of Christmas, January 2021, by border closures and the fact that offices were still closed, workplaces were still closed. So that was a big issue for employers at the beginning of the year. Then throughout the whole year, we had the working from home versus return to the office debate. Employers worked really hard to decide what the future of their workplaces might look like, putting in place policies around hybrid work or making decisions about how much or how little, or whether they were going to facilitate remote working at all. So that was interesting, and that's ongoing. But I think a lot of the big decisions were made during the course of 2021. And then the final kind of COVID related issue that was a big issue for employers was the whole vaccine piece. So by now, about 90% of the Irish adult population is vaccinated, but in September or thereabouts, the Data Protection Commissioner issued some guidance to employers, and her view was that because vaccines are voluntary, then that would suggest they're not absolutely necessary for workplace safety. And as a result of that, the processing of vaccine data can't be justified or isn't proportionate for data privacy reasons. And what that meant in really simple terms for employers was that they couldn't ask employees whether they were vaccinated or not. Now, well, that sounds fine and everybody has differing opinions about it. What it actually meant is that it had a huge impact on employers in trying to ready their workplaces for employees coming back. But it also had an impact in relation to employees going on client sites, not necessarily in Ireland, but across the US and other countries where clients, suppliers had vaccine-only sites and have vaccine-only sites, but also making an impact around, or had a huge impact and continues to have an impact around trying to organize travel for employees, not knowing their vaccine status. So that continues to be an issue and continues to be a cost for employers, but it's something that employers are living with. So they're kind of the big COVID issues for 2021. The second issue for 2021 was a Supreme Court decision that issued in April. It was a decision of Zaleski, and it related to, or it resulted from a constitutional challenge to the Workplace Relations Commission, or the WRC as we call it. And while the WRC survived the challenge, the Supreme Court held that certain aspects of how the WRC conduct hearings were unconstitutional. So they included the taking of evidence on oath and the fact that hearings to that point had been conducted in private. So while those issues were unconstitutional, it meant the government then had to go and pass legislation to fix those issues. And that legislation wasn't passed until the end of July. So in the meantime, employers were left in this kind of space where only some hearings were going ahead. There was uncertainty, and there remains uncertainty around what happens with cases that were part heard, whether there's a conflict of evidence which requires then evidence to be taken on oath. So it's for the most part, it is fixed now, but it did have a big impact for 2021, particularly around kind of delays and employers not knowing when they were going to get, employers and employees not knowing when they were going to get hearing dates or what was going to happen in relation to cases that were part heard. And for the most part, many of them had to start afresh. And obviously that has cost implications and timing implications for both sides. So big issue for us in 2021, but hopefully most of that now has been addressed heading into 2022. So the big challenges for employers heading into 2022, again, there's two I'm going to mention. The first is the level of employment in Ireland, and not strictly a legal issue, but it does impact the workplace. So at the moment, we have a kind of a tale of two stories. We have an employment rate, which at the end of November is just over 5%. So an unemployment rate of just over 5%. Like, that's fairly close to full employment if you take the view that, you know, approximately 4% of the population just don't want to work or won't work. So that has a massive impact for employers on recruitment, on retention, and that translates into work for employment practices like ours in Mason Hayes and Curran, which shifts towards looking at things like incentive programs and focusing on rewards and engagement. And that's interesting because the work changes as the economy grows or contracts. So that's actually interesting, but it's only one part of the story, because at the other end of the scale, we have certain employers in certain sectors who have been absolutely savaged by COVID. And while the government at the beginning of the pandemic passed legislation to suspend the entitlement of employees who've been laid off to look for redundancy payments, that suspension was lifted on the 30th of September 2021. So since October, and I suspect into 2022, there are certain pockets of the economy where we will continue to have those applications for redundancy from employees who have been laid off and whose employment in those sectors continues to be patchy. And it'll be interesting to see how things pan out over the course of 2022 in relation to those sectors. So a tale of two halves in relation to the to employment in the economy. So that's the first challenge for employers in 2022. The second issue then for 2022 isn't so much a challenge, it's just what's on the horizon for employers, and that is the government's legislative programme, specifically in relation to employment. So 3 pieces of legislation I want to mention. The first one is our long-awaited gender pay gap reporting legislation. That's ready to go. We're just waiting for the government to pull the trigger on it, and that will then come into force, and that will have a tiered effect over the course of the next few years. There's also amendments to whistleblowing legislation coming down the track, the introduction of statutory sick pay. And then we also have the government's strategy on remote working. So in that space, we are expecting legislation around the right to request remote working. It's not a right to remote working, it's a right to request remote working.